Okay, welcome everybody to this session of the COWS Web 2021. The theme is connectivity. I'm Tony Chan, I'm the president of COWS. I have the pleasure to introduce the speaker today, Professor Gabriel Leung from University of Hong Kong. I happen to know Gabriel for, say, over a decade. And so I would like to give him a formal introduction, but also since I know him, I give him a little bit of a personal introduction. So let me start with the formal part. Gabriel is the 40th Dean of Medicine, an inaugural Helen and Francis Simon Professor in Population Health in the University of Hong Kong. He holds the Chair of Public Health Medicine. He was the last head of community medicine before this post at the university. In addition to his academic positions, he was kind of unique also to have served as the first Undersecretary for Food and Health of the Hong Kong government, as well as the 5th Director of the Chief Executive Office, so that in a way the Chief of Staff of the head of the Hong Kong government. Gabriel is one of Asia's leading epidemiologists and global health exponents, having authored more than 500 scholarly papers with an H-index of 67. His research defined the epidemiology of 3 novel viral epidemics, namely SARS in 2003, the influenza A in 2013, and most recently, of course, COVID-19. He also led the Hong Kong government's effort against pandemic of the H1N1 in 2009. Most recently, for COVID-19, he has been an official advisor to the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region government, and also the Chinese Central People's Government, as well as to numerous overseas jurisdictions and international agencies, including the World Health Organization. So I think he's highly qualified. You cannot get someone better to speak on the topic of today. But a little bit about his educational background. Gabriel has actually a very international educational background. I think he was born and raised in Hong Kong, but he went to high school at a tender young age in the UK. Then the family moved to Canada, where he actually went to medical school at the Western Ontario University. So then he got a Master of Public Health at Harvard University. And then he finished that off with getting a Doctor of Medicine at the University of Hong Kong. While in Hong Kong U, during SARS in 2003, he directed the Infectious Disease Epidemiology Group. You want to say something more about that? And SARS, in a way, has been a very good learning experience and a precursor of the COVID-19 that we're going through. Okay, Gabriel also very distinguished internationally. He's a member of the U.S. National Academy of Medicine. Now, a little bit about him personally. You're looking at him in the face. He looks very young. He looks like a postdoc, maybe. He is actually as young as he looks. So he's one of the youngest. Everything that what he has done. He certainly is one of, if not the youngest dean of medicine in University of Hong Kong. So that's something to note. He's also very much a public figure in Hong Kong. I still watch sometimes of Hong Kong news. He's in the news a lot because of COVID-19 and other things. He's very much involved in the civic life in Hong Kong. Another part of him that is not as well known is that he is a really accomplished musician. That's not in any official CV. In fact, I read a story about him where he was choosing when he applied to school, to undergraduate school. He had to choose between 2 M schools. One is medical school, the other is music school. And the story is that he was hoping that he would turn down by the medical school. Then he would go to music school. But he got admitted to the medical school and probably some family pressure. He started choosing medicine. And I think the world and certainly Hong Kong has you to thank so that you are now in the profession and helping our Hong Kong. He's still active. I think he conducts you probably still play, Gabriel. I don't know. I know you play the piano and percussion and things like that. And I think an interesting message, Gabriel, I don't know whether you know about this. WEP is the Winter Enrichment Program. It's kind of a unique program at KAUST. We do 2 weeks straight with a lot of speakers like yourself, global figures. And the idea is to open up the mind and the horizon of our students. But now this year, because of pandemic, we open up to the world because now it's virtual, so everybody can do it. And I think there are many messages, in a way, all the speakers are role models. For example, you can be good at medicine and good at music. There's no conflict, I think, in that sense. Anything I want to say? Maybe I say a little bit about the theme. The theme of WEP this year is about connectivity. I would say COVID-19 in some sense has made us more isolated because we are all like quarantined, keeping social distance at home. But on the other hand, it's actually making us all connected. First of all, we are part of humanity. We're all affected by the pandemic. The virus doesn't care what ethnicity, what national origin you are from. So we are all connected. We're also connected through like Zoom and so on. We are now connected. So this is a very good theme. We're all connected to science, right? Because this, after all, to tackle the virus, we need to know about science. And it's not just medicine. Epidemiology, I know a little bit about. It involves a lot of statistics and human psychology, how to do things like that, in addition to the chemistry or biology. Hong Kong is a special case. I think in the Hong Kong, I was actually in Hong Kong visiting for a few days in middle of January, I remember, because of, the Yidan Prize. It was in January, so there was a board meeting. And we all heard about Wuhan at that point already. But, it was not in the news, nobody paid attention, really. I didn't feel anything, everybody was going out. And shortly after I returned to Saudi Arabia, then we know, many things were happening. But Hong Kong has been put up as a role model for the rest of the world as having been able to successfully keep things under control in the beginning. But then, of course, it got hit by the second wave. And there was a lot of things, I'm sure Gabriel will talk a little bit about that. And right now, I think Hong Kong is in the third wave. I mean, I was following the news the last few days. Like yesterday, there was over 100 cases. Now, which for Hong Kong is already all the red flags are going up and so on. If you compare to some other part of the world, this is like in the round off. But I think Hong Kong has gone through several waves of this experience. And I think it should continue to be a role model, for the rest of the world. Saudi Arabia, I think, has been doing quite well in this respect. And for example, we have started a vaccination, say, almost a month ago, so certainly like 3 weeks ago. I know Hong Kong is about to start the vaccination. Just today, the news is that we've been taking the Pfizer BioNTech. Just today, the news is that Moderna and the AstraZeneca Oxford one has been just approved. So we're getting the news. So we look forward to Gabriel's talk to talk about connectivity, but also the experience that he has in Hong Kong, but also elsewhere. He's been involved with WHO and so on and so on. So Gabriel, please, the format is, Gabriel, you will have like 40 to 45 minutes. Hopefully we'll start. We have 15 minutes or so for Q&A. So I will moderate that. So Gabriel, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Tony. It's really great to see you, albeit virtually. But this is the way that we connect with each other. So huge pleasure to be giving this talk. So maybe allow me to just share my slides. I hope that you can actually see them. I'm a little bit well, not a little bit, but I'm actually absolutely petrified talking about connectivity and epidemics because it involves a lot of maths. And of course, Tony, your president, is a mathematician. So I'm going to be venturing into very dangerous waters. So I'll pretend to be a mathematician for a little while. Just allow me to do that. So that's what I'm going to be talking about. And here we go. going to be sort of showing you how connectivity and the mathematics of connectivity actually have been studied, and then try and link it a little bit later to the spread of diseases, and then to show you some of the work that we and others have been doing, applying those principles and insights for COVID-19 control. So first off, connectivity. And if you look at this is a paper published in Nature 15 years ago now. So it's a very interesting paper. What it does is to use, is to track money, actually. So tracking notes, it's almost like tracking movement of people, because this is talking about cash. So as you can tell, this is a 15-year-old paper. So the data is probably about 20 years old. So when we still have a lot of cash going around. So what the research group did was, for obviously here you see continental US, you essentially see how cash, banknotes, have actually traveled. And panel A obviously is just basically showing you the basics, where people live, where there's initial entry of that banknote, and then how it tracks across the country. And looking at 4 cities in different parts of the country that are West Coast, East Coast, the South, and of course Middle America. And what you see in terms of these vertices, these are the most frequently traveled routes of tracing the banknotes with an origin of the same color. So this would be origin Seattle, and then these would be the most traveled routes according to those banknotes. And then when you see the dots, these are actually less traveled. So that's why, to declutter the diagram, the research team have not actually connected up all of them. But you can see the distances that these banknotes traveled. And this is sort of pre-social media pervasiveness. That's one of the ways that you actually track human mobility, is to track banknotes. And of course, for those of you who are students of mathematics or experts in mathematics, you will immediately recognize that you see basically the power law here. Of course, what you are seeing is this is distance on a log scale, and then this is essentially how long it took the banknotes to travel within a certain period or a certain distance. And this is, whatever you do in terms of tracking human mobility, that's the kind of figure that you will come up with. It's very, very sort of consistent. And this is that power law relationship. Now, if you then sort of go with a different paper that came out a couple of years after that, this is more than a decade ago. And so you could actually do the same thing, track human mobility, but this time you actually do it using mobile or cellular tower triangulation data. So there is a science of how you actually triangulate the position of people and then track movement through the phone device that every one of us carry nowadays. And panel B here actually shows it for one person, okay? So essentially, you can tell from here what those things are. So the green dots are the mobile phone or the cellular phone towers. And then essentially what this actually tracks in red are the recorded paths of actually that person who owns that cellular phone. That's where they actually go. And you can see that there are some preferred positions. So they don't actually, I mean, these are probably home and then work and then maybe the kid's school. And they don't really go very far. And this is for one person. And this A here, this A panel shows this person here, doesn't really go very far. And then for 39 others, so there are 40 unique mobile phone users here. And this is essentially plotting their mobility. And if you then go and do some clever mathematics, then you will, of course, see the same power law, which we saw with banknotes. And you also see, and you can appreciate the bounded nature of human mobility or human mobile trajectories, okay? So very, very much bounded. And then these, you can see, they actually plateau out, okay? So the bounded nature of human trajectories in terms of human movement. And these are very interesting, obviously, and they can be applied to a lot of different things. But importantly, on transmissibility of infectious diseases. And this is really what I hope that we can talk more about. And I think that this is one of the most exciting fields that we are currently in terms of pandemic control. So I'll show you another paper, also from about a decade ago. This was in PNAS. And it shows you two things. The upper panel, panel A, shows you essentially flight paths, all right? So domestic flights within continental US. And of course, the hotter the color, the more intensively these routes are used. And of course, you can tell this is Chicago, obviously, a huge major hub. This is New York, no doubt. And so you do see that there are these major transport hubs and they get actually reflected, okay? And here you see actually commuting networks. So this is basically driving. And again, the hotter the color, the more use these routes. So Route 98, Route 125, up in the northeast of the country where actually your president used to roam about and live. Of course, you do see the Bay Area, and you do see, the major centers. There's a lot of commuting. There's a lot of commuting going on. Now, having this kind of information, which is precisely another way of looking at human mobility, just like banknotes or cell phone data, then if you actually then try to study the relationship with infectious disease spread, and you will be able to see global profiles, regional profiles, and domestically within the US, and then within New England in the northeastern seaboard of the US, and looking at different cities. So as I said, Boston, Bedford, Providence, Portsmouth, very, very well-known cluster, and at different levels of geographic aggregation, whether it's down to a small part of the eastern seaboard in the US, all the way to global profiles, no matter which kind of level of aggregation you see, if you actually fit those travel patterns into a transmission model and then seed it, you will find, and here is the sort of conclusion, these commuter flows, on average, they are 1 order of magnitude larger than airline flows, obviously, because most people don't fly to work and they don't fly all that often, whereas a lot of people commute on a weekly, if not daily basis. But the introduction of commuter traffic into the global model shows that large-scale pattern of this epidemic model, which is a transmission model, would only be slightly affected or influenced with respect to the baseline where you only consider air traffic. Now, this is not at all surprising in terms of whether we're going to get a global outbreak or not. But it is important to note that the presence of these short-range commuter mobility, you actually then have local effects where you synchronize a lot of subpopulations. So for example, here in the Boston area in New England, you actually synchronize their epidemic behavior. So rather than having disparate outbreak patterns, once you have a lot of commuter traffic, then you get a much larger synchronized epidemic going through. So that's what we found, or they found. And also, you will see that spreading pathway is completely dominated in this kind of diagram, as you can see, by airline hubs, right? Chicago, look at this, as the only sources of imported seeds, okay? But the hierarchy is broken if you actually introduce commuter traffic as the number of shells around your airline hubs. So again, Chicago is a very famous airline hub in the US. If you actually introduce these commuter flows around the hubs, and then you have a lot of increase in the secondary nodes. So again, you see this kind of relationship between connectivity of human populations, human mobility, human population mixing, and how you actually get epidemics, and sometimes you get synchronized epidemics. Now, this is a very recent paper. This is from Caroline Buckey's group at Harvard, and they look at Bangladesh, okay? So this is in South Asia. This is, of course, India. This is Bangladesh, and this is just blowing it up. And this really shows, again, a heat chart geographically of the distribution of malaria in the country. This is forestry coverage of the country. And then you have unions sharing more than one parasite with identical gene signatures of these malaria samples. And then the top 50% of the most traveled routes, okay, by survey, and this is by mobile data. So this is essentially the panel showing you the raw ingredients of that mathematical model. Then through clever mathematics, you can actually now get these conclusions. And that's basically estimated parasite, malaria parasite, obviously, flows between unions or different places in the country based on A, travel survey, B, mobile phone data, C, both. So you get a lot more information, a lot richer information. And here, the red actually shows high incidence areas. And blue, okay, and blue, percentage of imported cases. Or you can see overlap, purple, for both. And essentially what you see is these findings, contrary to dogma, basically say that frequent mixing occurs in low transmission regions here in the Southwest, and elimination. And in addition to reducing imported infections from forested regions, and you can see that the forested regions are, of course, in the eastern part of the country. So unlike risk map just generated from clinical case counts alone, this new approach that takes into account all these disparate pieces of information, a lot of it showing connectivity, can distinguish areas of frequent importation as well as high transmission. Okay, so frequent importation, high transmission. And the transmission is mostly because of the forested areas. But you do see in the Southwest this new insight, which goes a long way to controlling malaria in Bangladesh. So now, I've shown you how connectivity of human beings, mobility of human beings, and the mathematical prosecution of those data are interesting phenomena. Then how they link up and have been demonstrated to link up with infectious disease spread. And now we come to the application of these insights and these models in COVID-19. And so I'm going to show you one of the, well, it is the first model in the world to basically call out the fact that we actually have a pandemic. So this piece of work was done in the 2nd and 3rd week of January, so exactly 1 year ago. During the time that, in fact, Tony, your president, was in Hong Kong, and he just told you that he didn't really worry too much about it, and people have heard about Wuhan, but there were about 40 cases at that time that were reported. So people thought, okay, no big deal, life as usual. So during those periods, what we then did was to say, look, we have heard about reports first of a cluster of 11 cases from Wuhan, then 40, then 50 something. And then it was that period, and then we thought, okay, well, we get very worried. And the reason is this, because every year around this time, there is the so-called Chunyun, which is Spring Festival related travel. So Chinese New Year related travel. It lasts 40 days every year. That straddles basically Chinese New Year. And so last year, Chinese New Year was January 25th. And the first day of the Spring Festival related travel started on January 10th. So we said, well, hey, what if during this travel all over the country, which is the largest human migration, by the way, that takes place on an annual basis, much larger than anything else, American Thanksgiving, the Hajj, everything, okay? So you can imagine if there was something really big going on in Wuhan, it would actually go nationwide and then from there to the rest of the world. So we got a lucky break, I suppose, because we started in the 2nd and then certainly by the 3rd week of January, started seeing some exported cases outside of mainland China to Japan and to Thailand. In Tokyo and in Bangkok, those airports stepped up their surveillance and then started picking up a handful of cases. And so from that and from IATA air traffic data, the same data set that actually informed the previous study back in 2009, we actually got an updated data set and we said, okay, well, given the traffic volume from China to Thailand or to Japan, what is the likelihood that you would actually see an exported case? And given that, we infer backwards to say, well, if you actually see these handful of cases, given that kind of traffic, air traffic connectivity, how many there must have been in Wuhan itself? And then once we've got that backward inference of the epidemic size in Wuhan, then we use that to seed the rest of the country based on train traffic volume, which is basically the main mode of transport for people to go back to their ancestral villages or their own provinces to visit family and relatives for Chinese New Year. So that's essentially what we did. Mathematically, we built a model to do that. And then what we found was this. So essentially, this right side figure is what we said, base case is in blue, and then red and green are different sets of assumptions. And at that time, we weren't sure whether it was just human-to-human spread, or was it actually, less frighteningly, still mostly zoonotic. That is, it kept jumping from animals into humans. So as you can see, we actually had two assumptions. One was that the force of infection of that animal-human jump was half of that of the base case or double that of the base case, okay? But be that as it may, we then made a guess at what the basic reproductive number actually is. And you can see that here in this probability density function, for our base case, it's probably, given this kind of reproductive number, this is the kind of PDF you will see. And then the total number of cases, okay, at the time, and then the total number of infections. These are clinical cases. This is total number of infections, okay? So we've got this, which is the size of the epidemic at that stage in Wuhan by the 3rd week of January. And then we said, well, if that's the case, what would be the likely effect in the rest of the country? And these are major cities with connections to Wuhan, which is smack in the middle of the country. Now, this is our report card. So we made that call on the 23rd of January, which is the 3rd week of January. You will see that this was very, very early. So that's the red in color. And then subsequently, we got data and said, okay, how many cases were there actually? Okay, we allowed for a 5-day delay, which is exactly the incubation period. Okay, so we said, okay, well, how right or wrong were we? So you can see that we were actually almost spot on for the whole country except Changsha, Nanchang, Hangzhou, Wenzhou, and then Chongqing. But we're not off by much. I mean, if you actually look, I mean, this is, 150 versus 230. So we're pretty much spot on. And then if you actually go and extend that by a few days, depending on how long the incubation period is, we are almost exactly there. Okay. Now, if you take a more careful look, okay, and then look at the proportion of outbound traffic from Wuhan by road, right? Because we said we had a lot of good data by train, but for the places that had significant road traffic that people drove or traveled on buses, then we actually were a little bit off, but not by much, okay, with these places. So this report card shows you that actually these things could work. And I actually just a minute ago was talking to a reporter asking, hey, how come a year ago you actually were bold enough to call the pandemic a real pandemic and you actually guessed right? And I said, well, we didn't guess. Actually, we did research, and this is exactly what we did. This is also what we said we would do. And what we needed to say was what could happen, not what would happen. We are epidemiologists. We are not soothsayers or feng shui masters. We're not interested in predicting what might happen. We are most interested to show policymakers what could happen. And therefore, if this is basically what could happen if there were no controls put in place, this is what could happen if there were some controls put in place to reduce transmissibility by 1/4. And this is what would happen if 50% transmissibility reduction were put in place. So we argued then we have to really hit this pandemic very, very hard in order to bring about this situation, which is exactly, of course, what mainland China did. Because you will see that the confirmed cases as of November last year, which is basically because the Chinese epidemic was over by March. But essentially, if you actually look at these real numbers, the blue is actual numbers, and the red, the various degrees of red, showed basically our base case with no intervention, some intervention, a lot of intervention, and basically just squashing it. And you can tell that basically in the rest of the country, ex-Wuhan, it was very, very successfully suppressed, such that it basically reduced spread by somewhere between 75 to 95%. Wuhan took a little bit longer, and the reduction was somewhere probably in the 60% range, and that's why it had a much bigger epidemic. It was the original epicenter. This was then confirmed by a joint mission of WHO and China, of course, I had the honor and the privilege of actually being part of this mission in February to actually look at on the ground what has been going on. And this is Baidu. Baidu is a sort of the Google equivalent or the Yahoo equivalent in mainland China. It has a intra-city traffic volume index, and for Beijing, Shanghai, Shenzhen, and Wenzhou, major cities on the mainland, it actually shows that, the lockdown, not just in Wuhan, starting from the 4th week of January, compared to a year ago, it basically showed this huge reduction, this huge dramatic drop in traffic, essentially a countrywide lockdown. And that, of course, then essentially suppressed this pandemic first wave in China across the country. And this is the second paper that we put together, and we actually had it out in March, also in the Lancet. And the upper panel shows the Epi curve, and the lower panel shows the inferred reproductive number. And as you can see, the unity number is 1.0. So anything above that will show that the epidemic has the potential to grow exponentially. Anything below that shows that it will fade away eventually. And as you can see, actually for Beijing, the number never really went above 1. And for Shenzhen, it never really went above 1. For Shanghai and Wenzhou, briefly it did, but then following that lockdown countrywide in the 3rd week of January, things really dropped. So that transmissibility index really dropped. And then eventually, as you can see, there were no more cases, except for green, which is importation from overseas. By March, then China was actually receiving imported cases. So mostly these were from Italy, actually. And similarly, if you look at the top 5 case burden provinces, you see actually the same pattern. Now, coming back to my home, which is the southernmost part of the country in Hong Kong, we have another proxy for human mobility. This time it's called the Octopus Card, which is a ubiquitous card that 95% of Hong Kongers have. And we could actually tell by the type of fare, so whether it's a child, a student card, an older adult card, or a regular card for adults, and it applies to all forms of transport. So we can actually track population movement using digital data, this digital footprint. And that's what we did. And essentially, what we did was to try to plot out the epidemic curve. We stratified by local cases, which is in orange, versus imported cases. And therefore, we concentrate on the local cases because the imported cases has nothing to do with mobility within Hong Kong, because everybody who's been imported, they were stopped at the airport and then they were isolated. And so if you then look at these by confirmation date, which actually is delayed, there is at least a 7 to 14 day delay between date of confirmation and date of infection. So we can, through a series of what we call deconvolution processes of these time delay distributions, we can then move this back to infer the onset date, okay? And then with the onset date, then you can, then using a very simple procedure that was worked out by Jaco Wallinger in the Netherlands, to give the plot of the reproductive number in real time. And as you can tell, we again have this one unity value. So we started off with a fairly high R0, which is sort of the natural R0, 2.5 to 3. And then we very quickly suppressed our first wave, then had our second wave because it actually went back up to the natural R0 when we relaxed our physical distancing measures. Okay, so there's white here. Green, we had a lot of physical distancing measures, but once we relaxed, then it came back. Okay, and so once we put it back in, then you suppress it again. So what we wanted to do was to say, hey, now that we've got the RT curve, which is red here, can we look at the octopus or the mobility tracker data and see, just eyeballing, I mean, this is the Spearman's R, so it's basically looking at just correlation, which one actually correlates best? And we find that the adult transport correlates best. R of 0.8 is actually not bad at all. And if you then pick this and fit a mathematical model, actually a statistical model to be more precise, and then basically you are looking at time slicing, okay? As we move from left to right, we're time slicing. So essentially, the red is the RT, the blue is the nowcasting, and the green is the forecasting. So there is up to a 2-week delay if you do empirical RT estimation. The blue allows you to, based on our data, give you real-time support, and then the green gives you a forecast. So you can tell if we actually use our method with the Octopus data, the mobility tracker, we could actually quite accurately, when this thing comes down, we could actually already by this date already tell that it's going to go back up again. And if you actually follow and just move your eye from left to right, you will see that the red actually tracks the blue, which tells you that the blue and the green were very, very good at predicting the actual trajectory, oftentimes with a 1 week to 10-day advance, so as to allow policymakers to anticipate rather than fall behind and track the movement of that epidemic. So your policies could be just in time and anticipate the epidemic rather than trail the epidemic. So this piece of work hopefully is going to come out soon in print. It is under review at the moment. Finally, I'm going to try and convince you again why it matters to study human connectivity. So here we're looking at the use of contact matrices. That's basically who infects whom, or who is usually in contact with whom in any population. So there is another sort of art or science in that. And I'm going to use the example of school closures in COVID to illustrate this. So my friend and colleague, Mark Lipsitch, who is one of the foremost modelers in the world at Harvard, and his wife, Mira Levinson, who teaches at the Harvard Education School. They wrote a piece in the New England Journal together, and I think this is actually deeply, deeply felt and deeply touching to me. They wrote, whether and how to reopen primary schools is not just a scientific and technocratic question. It is also an emotional and moral one. Our sense of responsibility towards children, at the very least, to protect them from the vicissitudes of life, including the poor decision-making of adults who allow deadly infections to spiral out of control, is core to our humanity. So it is very important. School closure is not just a pandemic measure, but it actually has a lot of corollaries. And they made a very persuasive case that it could be seen as a moral one as well. The World Bank Education Division wanted to know what effect it has on learning outcomes in terms of learning adjusted years of schooling lost because you closed schools due to COVID, the average learning loss of PISA scores, these are the math and language scores of PISA, which is used and adopted and paid attention to by governments worldwide, and also the share of learners who don't reach a minimum proficiency level. So this would be particularly important for low and middle income countries. So they also did their own simulation model. And what they found was across the board, regardless of which of these outcomes you look at, and the orange is the base case, you are losing 7% of learning adjusted years of schooling worldwide. The expected earnings translated would mean $872, okay, PPP dollars. And the average PISA scores are going to fall 4%. And most worryingly, you're going to hurt the low and middle income country students much more than people in the rich world and those disadvantaged groups everywhere in the world, where you see that the share of students who don't quite reach that minimum level increase by 25%. So closing schools is not all motherhood and apple pie. It may actually reduce or control your pandemic, but it definitely has all these very, very harmful corollary consequences. Now, if you actually look, this is from The Economist just a couple of months ago. In the US, once you have school closures, depending on which social class you belong to, you have this negative growth in terms of participation in online maths coursework. You will see that it really doesn't hurt the high income kids because they will be protected by their socioeconomic position and by their parental guidance. In fact, it actually goes up. But for people in the middle to the lower social classes, it hurts them tremendously. They don't really get to do online maths coursework, and therefore they will lose out disproportionately. So now, faced with that, I show you another piece of evidence, which is essentially an evaluation of whether school closures really save lives in terms of daily incidence of COVID cases and also deaths in the US. So this is a paper that was in JAMA, and it's a very, very prestigious medical journal. It's essentially an interrupted time series negative binomial model, and it's negative binomial, it's not Poisson because of the over-dispersion, but you can think of it as a Poisson process. And essentially, it looks at all 50 states. It basically says, all right, you know what? There is a huge step change you can see after the school close, taking care of the time lag and the latent period, that actually school closures really, really work, okay? So that's what they try to argue. But if you actually read the paper and understand the statistics, you probably say, hey, there were no controls because the entire country did it more or less at the same time. Plus, there is covariance with other public health and social measures or non-pharmaceutical measures, like social distancing, wearing a mask, and all that. So the sort of 60% reduction in incidence and mortality are so implausibly high that you begin to think, oh, maybe, is there something wrong? So that's really what's motivated us, because with this kind of evidence, if it shows this kind of dramatic effect, it's very hard to argue against school closures on a sustained basis. So what we did was also look elsewhere. What did other people find? This is basically contact tracing data in South Korea. And if you look at the sort of non-household, that's general community attack rate, okay, it's, you know, below the age of 30 or 40, it's very low compared to the older folks, but we're not really sure what's going on. So we thought, okay, you know what, we're going to actually do a proper study. So we got very detailed contact tracing data from 2 Chinese cities, in Shenzhen and in Anqing. This is in Anhui province, which is where the Chinese University of Science and Tech, your counterpart, is actually located. So very detailed contact tracing histories. And then we parameterized a model. This is now under review. Has been a while now, actually. And we wanted to find out what is the relative susceptibility of different age groups and the relative infectiousness. Relative susceptibility means that how susceptible is a child compared to an adult to catch COVID. And relative infectiousness is what is the likelihood of a child infecting an adult compared to an adult infecting an adult. So we use this model that we parameterized using very good empirical data, and we found that, look, you know what? Relative susceptibility of school-age children is actually only about 40% of adults, but they are probably just as infectious, okay? And so armed with that bit of information, then we've got the Polymorph Study, which is a study to look at the relative assortative mixing by age group. So you will see This is the age of the participant on the x-axis and the age of the contact in the y-axis. And this is for all of the EU countries, you know, Belgium, this is Germany, Deutschland, and then you have Finland, you've got Great Britain, Italy, Luxembourg, Netherlands, and so on. So they did it for the EU, and they started this project well over a decade ago, and then they updated it, okay? And so we took the most updated data set in terms of age-based assortative mixing, and we actually had data for the entire world. So we parameterized it for the entire world, 195 countries, stratified them by socioeconomic income level. And then we said, look, you know, the base case is there's no age effect of susceptibility. We're most interested in this for COVID, obviously, because we know that for COVID, there is only half the susceptibility in school-age children compared to adults. Whereas for flu, and we use the pandemic flu from 2009 as a comparator, whereas the exact opposite, children were twice as susceptible. So now what we looked at were three outcomes. One is the reduction in the reproductive number, the control threshold on the reproductive number. Okay, that is, what is the reproductive number? What does it have to be so that you can close schools and then it will go below 1? So what's your baseline threshold? How low does it have to be in order for school closure to push it below 1? And then C, the proportion reduction of infectious contacts in the workplace and the community that would have to be equivalent to closing schools. That is, if you don't close schools, you would have to reduce physical distancing and contact by that much to compensate for it. So if you look at the COVID-19 example, basically it shows you that it doesn't buy you very much in terms of R0 reduction, somewhere between 10 to 20%, even in high-income countries. And for low-income countries and middle-income countries, it buys you maybe 5%. It's not very effective. And the control threshold is your R0 would already have to be somewhere around 1.1, 1.2 in order to have school closure and to push it below 1. So you would already have to be fairly close to 1 already. That's basically reflecting that it's not a very effective measure on a sustained basis. And you could quite easily just reduce physical distancing and mixing amongst others in the community, maybe by 20, 30%, in order to compensate for not closing schools. That is to keep schools open, which is very different from what we had barely 10 years ago for the swine flu pandemic. So this is a new insight. And similarly, if you actually dissect out by age, this is the effect. So this is actually quite amazing because it is a stunning revelation to say, look, school closures, yes, it can have an effect, but it doesn't buy you very much. And you will have to do all of these other things to begin with in order for this to work. And you could actually substitute for it. That is, if you choose, you can close bars, you can close concert venues, you can close gyms in order that you can send your kids to school because of all those negative side effects that I talked about. Finally, I'm going to just show you when we actually use our model to parameterize these known events. Using our model, you can compare with published estimates. We actually compare very well, which gives us content validity of our model estimates. So that's all. These are the key people who have worked with me to make it happen, and these are all my funders over the years, allowing this work to be done. Looking forward to the Q&A and learning from all of you. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Gabriel. A very enlightening talk. So let me start the Q&A. We have at least hopefully 10 minutes by engaging in this a conversation between you and me first, and before we open up to the floor. First of all, as you said, as a mathematician, when I'm looking at this, it's quite amazing because you talk about models, you talk about math, and you have charts, and what is it? the power law. I understand what the power law is. Most public probably don't understand what that means. So it's good to know. But let me answer the first question, away from the technicalities. So you were very much involved with SARS, right? 2003. And Hong Kong was very in the eyes of the storm for the has Hong Kong learned some lessons from SARS that are applicable to COVID-19 from your personal perspective? And what about the rest of the world? Maybe you can answer that.
Well, I mean, I think that, there is this East Asian exceptionalism. So I just want to show you a couple of slides, and just to show you why I think it is so important to learn from our previous experience. But let me just give me 30 seconds to find those slides, because I think that it's actually very, very telling in terms of what we can learn from East Asia.
While you're looking, let me point out why you're looking. Because one thing we were involved here at COWS is, should we wear masks? From the early days. Because I had just moved from Asia, right, to Saudi Arabia. In Japan, in Hong Kong, everybody wears masks, even if you have a flu. But in the rest of the world, that's a very new phenomenon. Because remember, SARS was a learning experience, I remember, in Hong Kong, even for me, because I wasn't in Hong Kong, really. I wasn't living in Hong Kong. Anyway, that was one example, maybe cultural, but.
No, absolutely. I mean, I think that it's just so important that we really take these things to heart. I'm still trying, because I think that really is extremely telling. If I can find this, I would try to see if I can.
Maybe
here we go. Yes, I can find
okay.
it. No, I have it. Let me just share this slide. It's actually quite amazing. So now, if you actually look at this is as of I don't know, a month or so ago. This is the COVID burden, and essentially what you see is here in this inset legend is when the first case actually arrived. Okay, mainland China, Japan, Korea, and then US, and then the EU, and then Africa. And then the colors of the world map, where you have a lot of cases and then not so many cases. You can look. The whole Eastern Hemisphere, all right, they've been relatively spared compared to, say, Europe, the US. Now, Africa is a different case, and I think that there is a different story there. But look at the numbers. We're talking about millions in Europe and in the US, and we're talking about tens of thousands at most in East Asia, and of course, fully half of the world's population live east of the Suez Canal. And if you look at the deaths, which is these numbers, okay, on a per million basis, look at this. All single digits, at best, maybe a dozen per million. Look at these numbers. So the East Asian exceptionalism, I would attribute to this slide. You talked about this, Tony, about SARS. But if you actually go back, say 100 years, if you actually look, these are the major outbreaks and pandemics we have experienced as a human race. If you look, Asian flu, Hong Kong flu, clearly, by the name of these pandemics, they were first detected in our part of the world. Then you have things like the avian flu outbreak that was first detected in Hong Kong in 1997. Then the SARS outbreak, which was mostly in East Asia. And then you had hand, foot, and mouth, which is also mostly in East Asia. Then you had MERS, and South Korea had a very, very large MERS outbreak. Of course, your part of the world is actually the epicenter. And then you have the H7N9, which is also in China, and then COVID. So we've had so many of these, and I call it sociological imprinting. It actually allows people to really sort of learn from the experience and be very, very willingly compliant with these public health and social measures, just like masks, right? And people would go along with very, very, very prolonged periods of home quarantine and lockdown measures. Whereas you will remember those scenes where, say, you go to the Michigan State House with a rifle to protest against these quarantine or even mask orders.
Okay, so that adds a level of complication, you know. In fact, that leads to my next question, which, by the way, was asked by a number of the people in the audience. And that is these models. Many of them are based on mathematical models, statistical models. How good are they? In other words, so that's one question from the audience. But from my perspective is, how predictive are they? You know, you can use them to understand what has been going on, right? You can understand based on data, but you need them to be predictive, I would think, because then you need to inform policies. So for example, if you can say, is it a government is trying to decide on policy for lockdown or different degrees of lockdown? If you can tell them, right, based on our model, if you lock down this way, you will have this outcome, then it will help the politician to set policies. But I also understand that, you know, like most models, you cannot really have 100% assurance of what they are. I think especially in these models, because it depends on a lot of uncertainties, depends on human behavior, human psychology, cultural norms, how compliant people are. So what is the state of the art? How do people in epidemiology think about this? Because you can try very hard and come up with this model. You have a lot of responsibilities, right? People look up to, especially in a state of crisis. I remember the UK situation. In the early days, there was a lot of reference to the model from Imperial College. There was a lot of, you probably know the people there. And we were studying them ourselves here. You know, we have a lot of scientists. And the UK government was following that model and decided to do something. I forgot that. In fact, they would talk about herd immunity. And then supposedly the Imperial College group was saying, no, you don't want to go there. I think that was a case where it actually, the scientists were affecting policy. Okay, so my question overall for you is, from a public's perception, what kind of level of confidence you want them to believe in this model? Because you know they need to believe in it, because it affects policy, which affects them. So they need to believe in it, right? The power of science and so on. But you don't want them to be so blindly believing in it, because it's not like physics, you know, it's not like Einstein's theory of relativity or something like that, right? Because there's a lot of uncertainty. I mean, in a way, it's more like economics, I would think, in some sense. Anyway, just a general impression from you.
Right. Well, let me say that most infectious disease modelers actually started life as physicists. Yes. So let me just again share a couple of slides, which is from a deck that I prepared for a Keystone talk next week. So you get the preview. So modeling is really, you know, trying to approximate reality. So if you look at this picture, you know, this is reality, a butterfly. You can do model 1, which is basically pixelizing it. You can do model 2, which is contourizing it. And, you know, the more complex your model is, all right, you get closer to reality. And if you have a simpler model, you have a lot more distortion because you can't really tell what this is. Now, so reality is this, but we don't know what reality is. We only see a bit of reality. So, you know, imagine this is what you actually see. And what you want is for your model to tell you what the rest of the black space really is. So model 1 can give you this, okay? And you know, you can't really tell that this is really this, right? But remember, in a model, you don't know a priori what reality is. So model 1 gives you this, and you know, the more complex, the better the model, it will show you this. Model 2 shows you the same thing, but you know, it may actually then give you a false sense of security because it may turn out to be this. So this is my example, my favorite example of modeling predictions. Now, models are not really only used for predictions, but sometimes they are. And when they are, you have to be extremely careful. This is from a paper, very, very famous or infamous paper at the beginning of the HIV/AIDS epidemic or pandemic. You'll remember that, okay? So, and what they had data for in the US at that time was, 5 or 6 years of experience with HIV/AIDS. And then they tried to impose Farr's law. Farr was basically a statistician in Victorian England. So they used that law basically to say it's, what goes up must come down, and usually epidemics are bell-shaped. So that's essentially what they predict. And the conclusion of that paper, which informed US policy, was to say, look, we are never going to have more than 20,000 cases, even at a peak year, and it's going to go away. What, of course, happened was this. We know how the HIV epidemic actually panned out. And this is actually a paper by Tony Fauci, who is now known by every single person on earth because of what he did during COVID. Now, you mentioned the imperial model. Here is the imperial model, the ICL model,
yes,
right? And you can see that if you actually look at the imperial model, the red is the empirical training data set. What reality was blue. What they predicted at the time, okay, was orange. So the imperial model, even from the very early days, were not too bad. Look at it.
Yeah, not too bad. Yeah.
Not too bad. Because it was a real mathematical model. What the IHME, this is the Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation, this is Chris Murray's outfit in Seattle, Washington. What their model was basically a very fancy version of Farr's law. And of course, it didn't work at all until actually the empirical data was so far advanced that, basically then it just tracked it. So it wasn't very much useful. So it really depends on what kind of model you're talking about. And that's why we have to be very careful in picking and choosing models.
Yeah. Let me ask you my last question before I open up the floor. So, this is part of web. It's supposed to be an experience for our students. So what kind of lessons or inspiration do you think the student can get from listening to your talk? One, I hope, is to understand what epidemiology is about. By the way, we're a University of Science and Technology. I mean, there's a lot of science and technology involved. But I think another aspect I would think is you need to know a lot of things, not just in one special area. It's very interdisciplinary area. And I said before, it reminds me a bit of the discipline of economics. There are a lot of people who try to build models. Of course, they cannot predict what humans behave, and the condition change, and so on. And you have to affect policy, right? So what lesson would you leave with our student, coming out of this?
I think what I would say is, look, I hope that I've shown you that, the core basic sciences matter. So abstract mathematics and physics actually matter. So those first few slides of the talk actually show you, okay, so, why do mathematicians and physicists study, how cash moves around? Because actually the insights that they provide can have various uses, and one of which is actually to control COVID, as I showed you later on in the talk. So I hope that that's one message. And the second message is, once you've got those techniques, which are obviously why we all go to university, once you've got those techniques mastered, you have limitless application opportunities and therefore career opportunities. People who have the same skill set can go into applied physics. They can go into pure mathematics. They can go into becoming quants for investment banks and work out derivative products. Or they can go and work on global outbreak control. In the back of that, you would still have to go and do your ODE, PDE models. You would still have to go and understand calculus, you would still have to go and understand physical principles and properties. It's actually the same. So how you do the front interface and where you decide to spend and expend your talent, you can have, the world is your oyster. So that's why we do what we do, and presumably that's why universities have, good programs in mathematics, in engineering, and in physics.
I agree 100%. I'm glad you said it from your personal perspective. I think we are running out of time, but let me read some of the questions or paraphrase some of the questions from the audience for you. So some of these are like related to what I asked before. Like, for example, is lockdown the only solution to control the disease? I mean, related to my thing about the degree of lockdown, but, is that, how good are these models? You have to answer them. Now then, there's some question, I don't know whether you feel comfortable answering, because they are not really epidemiological question. Like, what about this mRNA vaccine? Should we trust them? Okay, what about this mutation of the viruses? How much should we worry about them? Let me just focus on those two first. Okay,
I think
you feel comfortable answering them? Yeah,
I think we should worry about these variants. And again, there is another application. Now that you bring up the variants, is another application of mathematical models. It's a very special branch of knowledge called phylogenetic, and essentially the variants actually show you very clearly convergent evolution of the bug SARS-CoV-2. And you see these separate and independent variant strains, emerging from the UK, South Africa, Brazil, amongst other places. And they actually are symptomatic of convergent evolution. I anticipate that they will actually become dominant as they spread around the globe, because they are certainly much more transmissible. A recent paper that we did on the 501Y variant strains from the UK actually indicates increase in transmissibility by 75%. So we should very much worry about them. The second thing is mRNA vaccines. I think it's a wonderful success and vindication of science. All the data point to good safety profile and very good efficacy profile. Although, of course, even though you run the trials on tens of thousands of people, but when you try to roll it out to millions, if not tens and hundreds of millions of people, you will learn as you actually see what actually happens on the ground. But I don't think that they are any more dangerous or risky than some of the other alternatives.
Yeah, let me ask you this related to the mRNA, because that's the Pfizer BioNTech one, which just, I took that myself, okay?
Yes.
And the Moderna, right, is announced today, it was approved by Saudi Arabia. But there's still a lot of questions and doubts, skepticism about, because they're so new. Because when you talk about RNA, people don't understand the problem, right? RNA, DNA, the same thing. You're sending some, like, people don't want to eat genetically modified food, right? You're injecting this into my body. So my question for you is, from a public health perspective, one is, if you vaccine, of course, you protect yourself. That people make their own individual decision. People say, okay, I do the weighting or the trade-off, I decide not to do it because whatever. But there's a public health angle to it too, I would imagine. So, I mean, one extreme, if everybody gets vaccinated, you have herd immunity, and then the virus should die out, right? So how important is that public health factor, and how do we get that message across so people have confidence in doing this? Because you cannot guarantee, that these vaccines are effective.
I think that it's important to recognize that the first generation of vaccines, including the mRNA vaccines, they were not designed to block transmission or block infection. They were evaluated, the primary outcome was to stop symptomatic disease, all right, and hopefully severe disease and deaths. So I think that it would be, unfair to try to infer that if even 100% of the world actually get vaccinated, you will then stop this epidemic. What it hopefully will do is to protect people from bad outcomes, but it's not going to stop this pandemic. Because I think that there'll be some protection against infection, but I don't think it'll be nearly as good as the 95% that protects people from getting sick. So I think there's a very subtle but important difference. So we will not go back to pre-COVID. COVID will not be wiped out and eradicated because of these vaccines that are available that we know about. It will probably take multiple vaccination drives. And I think that that's the kind of attitude we should take. I'm not saying that it won't stop infection at all, but I don't think that it is as perfect a tool for that as many of us imagine.
Yeah. Let me ask one more question from the audience. Maybe then we should close. The question goes like this: will having schools open, the average ages of affected people will change? More children, right, compared to adults might be affected. So what's the effect of that?
Well, we know that children are not nearly as susceptible. And secondly, we know that, except for this Kawasaki-like syndrome, which is a sort of multi-site or multi-organ inflammatory syndrome, which is probably part and parcel of that immune system overreaction that we see kill older folks. We do see very, very rare cases in children, not killing them, but actually causing some major problems, but very, very rare. So I think that, you probably would need to consider those as you weigh how important it is to put different types of measures. So of course, if you've got a raging pandemic and a raging outbreak, every little bit helps, then of course you should close schools. But what you should think twice about is using school closure as the first and primary sustained intervention, because it's actually not very effective. And the downsides are considerable.
Okay. Okay, thank you very much. There are many more questions, which I cannot, we don't have time to ask. So thank you again. Thank you for the audience to participate. I think the organizer would tell us, the recording will continue until where it stops, then you and I can continue our own conversation. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you for coming.